I wanted to build in my presentation on some of the work that I previously did at Policy Exchange, and to really share with you this idea of how should liberal societies deal with the threat posed by ostensibly non-violent organizations. And in this context, there is a view within the British state, for example, that you can use, and indeed you should use, non-violent but extremist groups to act as a bulwark against terrorist organizations. And the conventional wisdom behind this theory goes that these organizations channel people who are angry, who are disaffected, who feel disenfranchised, back into the political system. It brings them within the framework of the established organs and sectors of the state. It tells them to protest. It tells them to organize themselves in that way. And the idea is, of course, if you're doing that, you don't then seek out alternative avenues for your anger. So this is the way the British state has gone for the last few years, particularly in the context of trying to prevent people from going towards violent jihadist organizations. And our report, the Choosing Our Friends report, critiqued this, and we sort of sunk our teeth into this idea and began to explore it. And so I'll start with the first two problems that struck us with this approach. The first thing that really dawned on us was, what is the price of this engagement? On whose terms do you engage with these organizations? And what are you giving away, essentially, in order to bring them on board and to make them partners? So the idea is engagement, but on whose terms and at what price? And when you look really at the reality of how the state has had to engage with these organizations, we feel the price has been too high, that they've given away far too much, and that fundamental aspects of the British state, of the values, the normative values of the state, and of what we believe in, have had to be compromised, traded away, traded off, in order to bring some of these groups on board. The other aspect that dawned on us was, if you bring these groups on board, you essentially said something. It's the unspoken corollary of your view, which is you deny entirely that there is a link between non-violent political radicals and their violent counterparts. That, I think, is a huge statement, and one that is incorrect. Terrorist organizations, and in particular terrorist actors in themselves, operate within a particular milieu. They need a much broader social, political, and cultural network that vindicates their actions, that lionizes them, that essentially glorifies and promotes them, and creates the moral imperatives for what they're doing. And we see that all around the world, particularly in the case of the suicide bomber, who isn't around after his attack. But he knows that there will be people glorifying what he's done, that there will be people justifying it in the name of resistance, in the name of a glorious cause, and essentially validating what they've done. So it's about understanding that relationship between these organizations, and not to deny that link, but to understand and appreciate what's taking place there. And of course, many of these organizations, the non-violent radical ones, in the process of doing so, further fuel the anger of the terrorist organizations themselves and the actors. So establishing again and trying to work out that link between, on the one hand, your radical, ostensibly non-violent group, and then on the other hand, the violent ones, is, I think, too intertwined and far more enmeshed than the state has previously been willing to acknowledge or to accept, and therefore to tackle. And to give you an example of this, and I thought I'd use the example most pertinent to where we are, then in 2003, Britain's first suicide bombers emerged. And this wasn't the 7/7 attacks that we suffered in London, but two British citizens came to Israel, to Tel Aviv, and became suicide bombers. And ironically, their whole path towards radicalization had started in Britain through contacts with, as I say, these ostensibly non-violent groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, who although they didn't direct and plan and get involved operationally in these attacks, they set them on the process of a political agenda which eventually led them to go further and to seek more, and eventually led them to the destruction that we saw here in the end. So that is one sort of anecdotal example of this relationship, but there are many more that you could come to and to look at time and time again. The flip side, of course, is what is impossible to measure, which is how many people get involved in that sort of radical activity but don't become terrorists, and would have become terrorists but for that channel. And that is, of course, the counterfactual, which is very difficult for us to measure or to gain an accurate assessment of. The idea then is going down this road is a difficult one, because it's flawed, as we see it, from a theoretical perspective. It rests on this premise that you can use one group against the other. But as we found, it's also very flawed in practice. And in Britain, where this program has been running, it's known as the Preventing Violent Extremism Program. And I know foreign governments are looking at it, in particular from the United States and from Australia. The idea being, of course, you prevent people becoming terrorists, and in that sense, prevention is better than the cure. The idea is, this thesis rests on the idea, what we've called the sort of moderate Muslim Brotherhood thesis. But here's the difficulty. How do you establish and find out who the moderate group is? How do you begin to understand who are your legitimate partners? And for too long, at the moment at least, there's been a very slapdash approach to this. I'll give you an example of a case from America. It involves the now successful prosecution of the leaders of a charity called the Holy Land Foundation, which took place in Texas and was found to be a front for the Muslim Brotherhood. The leaders of the organization were prosecuted for channeling funds to Hamas and eventually, as I say, were convicted on those charges. What's less interesting is the nuance of that case, but more what comes out of it. And this is it. When the homes of the men involved were raided, they came across documents written by the global leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood explaining the entryist political model for groups such as them operating in the West. And the idea was to proliferate their organization and their message through seemingly innocuous front groups. So what do you do if you create the Society for Muslim Opticians and Physicians? Doesn't sound in itself a difficult organization or one that's going to have an overtly political outlook. But the idea was that by creating these multiple fronts, you advance your cause and your agenda and permeate it through society, both within the Muslim community and by becoming reference points for the non-Muslim community and creating that ability there to channel and further your agenda. Now, this is, of course, not to say that every Muslim group that arises is a difficult one or has an ulterior motive behind its cause. But the difficulty has been ascertaining and trying to find out how you go about this. And I'll come on to, towards the end of my presentation, talk about how we began to think about overcoming this and challenging it. Because, of course, the difficulty for many policymakers is they're not Muslim, they're not Arab, they're not from this part of the world where they can understand necessarily what these organizations are, or even from their names to deduce a sort of sense of the landscape. And so for many people it's an alphabet soup of names, of organizations, of individuals, and it's unclear how to go about dealing with it. So we did come up with a view on that, but I'll come back to it in a minute. The other point I wanted to touch on in this regard, however, was that in Britain we pumped in millions and millions and millions of pounds into these various initiatives in what were regarded to be high-risk communities. Again, the idea being that you create what they called sort of social resilience, social capital against this problem at the grassroots level. So areas like Bradford, Beeston in Leeds were given a lot of investment for art centres, for football groups or soccer groups, given lots of inward investment for these kinds of things. And it was interesting because it's not only necessarily the Muslim community or Muslim areas, for example, that are suffering from problems of social deprivation. So where does that leave other communal groups who want similar inward investment into their communities? Gets them nowhere. And it was found really that this whole agenda was breeding a lot of resentment on the grounds that ultimately what you were saying to many people was to attract this investment, to attract this attention from central government, you need to be engaged in some form of violent activity. So it bred much broader sense of resentment. And of course, the flip side to that is for young Muslims in Britain, what was the state ultimately telling them, implicitly at least? It was telling them that in the public sphere, the most important aspect of their identity was their Muslim identity. It didn't address them in alternative terms. It didn't address them as citizens of the state, as fellow Britons, but it was essentially saying, when you come to the state, when you come to negotiate with the state as an individual or with whatever interests you have, you need to come as a Muslim. And if you come on those terms, you're far more likely to succeed in your quest for whatever it is that you're looking for, particularly if done under the umbrella of the Preventing Violent Extremism, PVE, initiative. So it bred resentment on a very broad scale, and for that reason, it has been regarded by many people as a failure, and certainly the coalition, the new coalition government in Britain has now said in large part they're going to scrap most of the initiative, and those parts that are being kept will be looked at in much greater detail. So if you're going to criticize this program, you ultimately need to start thinking, what are the alternatives? How do we start to tackle and unravel this problem? Well, one of the first things we did was to argue that the government should stop seeing its Muslim constituents as just being Muslim. It should call upon them by different names and by the different aspects of their multiple identities. And to give you an example of this, we have a fierce debate that took place regarding an exhibition called the Islam Expo. It attracts up to 50,000 people, and its leadership are essentially, many of them, former commanders of Hamas who've taken refuge in Britain. They've claimed asylum, they now live there, and they run this thing. Now, in itself, the event isn't one big, long, obvious hate fest. A lot of people go because they run plays for children, they have poetry recitals, families go. It's a nice day out for many of them. And the government's argument is, if we don't go, we lose the ability to engage with these 50,000 people. And it's a lot of Muslims that we need to go and get a message out to. So the flip side, of course, is you are promoting by your appearance and tacitly endorsing a Hamas front. So how do you get around that? Well, I argued that every year in Bradford, instead of this conference, you have what's called the Bradford Mela. And the Mela is a South Asian word. It's just a festival, a carnival. 120,000 people go to that. It's not an exclusively Muslim event, but the vast majority of people who go are because of the local area. And if you want to engage people, you could do it through that platform. You'll engage twice the number through a neutral platform. And most importantly, you're going to the people as citizens of the state, rather than going through a political and charged platform which tells them that your communal, your confessional identity is what matters and what we regard as being important. So it's finding new ways to engage and finding new ways to bring your citizens into the dialogue of the state without necessarily calling upon and engaging with their confessional, or certainly exclusively with the confessional aspect of their identity. The other problem was the method of delivery, essentially, this engagement. Increasingly, it was being done through local councils, and it was all being localized into the local constituency. This created the problem that this problem is massive, and it's taken central government, it's taken many of us here many years to begin to understand the nature of the threat and how to begin to manage it down. When you devolve the power to local councils, many of which are staffed by very worthy local councillors, they don't have the resources, they don't necessarily have the expertise to begin to even take this on. So we argued in this instance, quite counterintuitively for our think tank, because we argue in favor of localism. But in this instance, we argued for centralization, because you need to have a central resource that begins to look at these organizations, groups, and come to terms with their agenda. But the real crux for us was the idea that rather than throw money into these groups, rather than go in and set up football schools, performance organizations, theaters, that kind of thing, in the hope that people won't be attracted by the Al-Qaeda narrative or whatever, we said you should adopt a values-led initiative. And what that means was you take the very basic fundamental aspects of your liberal society, everything that is you're seeking to protect against the terrorist threat, and you put these down as saying that these are fundamentally non-negotiable points. You don't criminalize people who don't agree to them. That's fine. If you want to disagree, that's your right. But you say to them, if you disagree with these points, you should not expect public funds. You should not expect a seat at the table of government to negotiate and to engage and to essentially be treated as a respectable partner worthy of having input into these matters, because for too long we've tolerated and indeed engaged with a lot of these groups despite them holding some very outrageous opinions. So I should clarify, in terms of engagement in this context, what we don't mean is the intelligence and security aspect. We understand and we appreciate, of course, field operatives will need to talk with people of all sorts. And in that aspect, we have no problem. What we're talking about is the official engagement at the governmental level, who you bring on as your partners, who you bring on as stakeholders for public approbation, for public promotion, and essentially the face of your engagement in that capacity. So this is quite distinct from the operational needs that practitioners in the field will find themselves wanting and engaging with, and we accept that. But the values-led narrative is very simple. We outlined eventually 9 criteria, and if you want to see them in their totality, you can go to the website and see them there. But very easy things like anyone who discriminates on the basis of sexual orientation, gender, religious belief, religious observance, the government should say that fundamentally strikes against our values. You can't be a public partner if this is what you stand for. Anyone that supports terrorist attacks anywhere in the world, not just in Britain, cannot be a legitimate partner of the state. It's very simple things. And no one can really argue against this. No one can really say, well, this is outrageous. These are the normative values of the state. And the state and the government has a right. And this is part of the problem, that for too long it has been unwilling to aggressively and evangelically promote what it stands for in this respect. So we called for a recapturing of the confidence in that sense, to come back into the frame and to say, this is what we stand for, this is what we believe in, and to move forward on those terms. What does it mean in practice then? Well, what we argued for was you bring people on the basis of this shared narrative, on the basis of your shared values, and from that premise you have an instant starting point from which to engage. You know where your partners now stand. You're not shooting into the dark, essentially, and hoping and praying that you will, in some capacity, win, and accepting on other hands that you will lose. This is public funds, and more so than that, you are dealing with a very real situation that the government and the public authorities essentially cannot be seen, and certainly should not be, engaging and promoting and supporting groups that on the one hand are saying one thing, but then ultimately feeding into organizations which fundamentally challenge and threaten and undermine everything that we stand for. So I know this is a sort of slightly different perspective on looking at this issue, and for many practitioners there's sometimes a sort of sense that this really isn't your game. This really is your game. Obviously you have two things that you're juggling here. You have the urgent threat, which is your suicide bomber walking down the street. You have to deal with him. But far more often, what you're going to encounter is the important threat. And it's that tension between the urgent versus the important. What is important, ultimately, is what we're trading off in society, what we're giving away in the name of security, ultimately in this belief that you can dissipate energy, that you can suck the heat out of situations, that you can pacify people through the promotion of non-violent, but yet extremist actors. And I'll just leave you with that, on the idea that this moderate Muslim Brotherhood thesis, it's not just about the Brotherhood. Many organizations like it out there. But what do we trade off in that capacity? How do we engage? On whose terms? And what do we lose in return for it? Thank you.